So this is Acts 28, the final chapter in the Acts of the Apostles and the scripture for the 24th of June. So Paul's now been shipwrecked on his way to Rome. So Paul and the ship's crew began to fend for food and shelter on the island of Malta, is what we learned they're shipwrecked on. But fortunately, the people of the island are able to give them assistance. One of the promises that Jesus gave his disciples back in the longer ending to the Gospel of Mark, we're talking Mark 16, I've linked the video for that below, is that they will pick up snakes in their hands. And here, in this chapter, we see Paul survive a snake bite with no negative effects. And this is a viper that the locals know to be like fatal. So this seems to lend credence to what Jesus may have promised the disciples in the Gospel of Mark. However, we're obviously not called to go out of our way to put ourselves in danger. That's not the call of the Christian. We're called to seek God's kingdom come, and sometimes that involves doing stuff that may not be entirely safe, but we're not called to just go out and play with snakes. That's not the calling of the kingdom, particularly without training. However, it's good to know that God is fully able to offer protection to those whose work is not yet done here on this earth, like Paul. So further evidence of Luke's doctor credentials appear here, describing Publius' father as not just sick, but as having dysentery. So after Paul heals him and others on the island, the natives are so grateful that they share provisions for the journey, which is a generous offer, which Paul and the crew accept because all of the stuff that they had is now in the sea. Upon arriving at Rome just a few months after getting shipwrecked at Malta, Paul wastes no time. He doesn't kick back, he doesn't relax, he doesn't take advantage of house arrest to, send folks off to get him furniture or whatnot. No, within 3 days, he's got contacts where he's reached out to the Jewish synagogues, to religious leaders in the area, and is like, hey, I want to meet with y'all. Fortunately, there's nothing prejudicing them against Paul because Paul has beaten the leaders of the Jerusalem temple to the punch in communicating with these Jewish leaders. They've not heard about all of the ruckus that's been happening down in Jerusalem because of Paul. And the set of beliefs about the way or Christianity or the sect that the Jewish leaders talk about apparently hasn't had a Jewish advocate or a Jewish defendant in Rome yet, since they say that this is the sect, this is the set of beliefs that everybody's speaking against. So they're eager to hear Paul, who at least talks a good talk as far as Judaism goes, and who says that he buys the story of Jesus of Nazareth. So Paul conducts himself similarly as in all his missionary journeys. He begins with the Jews and preaches the good news to them first. I think he identifies with them more as that's where he's come from. But then, after preaching the gospel with middling success at best to the Jews, he kind of wipes off his hands. He says, y'all take your lives into your own hands then. And then he makes a turn to go speak to the Gentiles. He does that same thing here in Rome. And just a verse after saying that, or a verse or two after saying that, the Acts of the Apostles ends. It ends with Paul preaching for 2 years from house arrest to anyone who would listen. And for those of you who may wonder, well, what happens next? Well, 2 answers for you. The first answer is the Acts of the Apostles is really the only history book in the New Testament. The rest of the books are either letters or they're gospels, which are a special version of history, or, as in the case of Revelation, are apocalypse. Acts of the Apostles is the only history book there, and to see sort of what happens after that, you'll need to look into early church history, reading some of the writings of Clement of Alexandria, perhaps. Tertullian is another one, and that kind of gets you a what happens next feeling. But if you're interested in knowing what happens next for Paul, there's a couple of theories, a couple of prevailing theories that are about. Some suggest that Paul was acquitted when he went before Caesar, and then continued on to Spain or to elsewhere on a 4th missionary journey. There's not necessarily mounds of evidence for this, although some scholars will point to writings by Clement of Alexandria and by Ignatius of Antioch, who was one of the first bishops, to support some of this. However, it's uncertain. What we do know, or what we're relatively certain of, is that Paul was martyred, and that Paul was likely martyred during the reign of Nero, which was between AD 54 and 68. And at this point, we're somewhere in the early AD 60s. So Paul may not have been acquitted by Caesar. We're not sure because Acts ends here. I want to thank you if you've been joining us for this walk through the book of Acts. And I want to ask you, I wonder, when was the last time you experienced rejection when sharing the gospel with others? And that's all for Acts 28, and that wraps up the Acts of the Apostles. Tomorrow on the 25th of June, we'll be beginning James with James chapter 1. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.